Hello and welcome. So what's this whole case with the Justice Fund all about? That applies to my case as well as the cases of Marcin Romanowski, Michał Woś and Zbigniew Ziobro. To put it simply, it's about, on one hand, destroying the politicians of the former Solidary Poland, now Sovereign Poland. It's about pushing them to the fringes of Polish politics. The goal is to ensure that the people who, within today's Law and Justice Party, represent the most conservative, the most Euro-realist views are completely eliminated. And the second issue is to constantly have a diversionary topic. On one hand, to cover up the scandals of the civic platform government, both their previous scandals and the new ones happening now. And on the other hand, to cover up, well, things like what was revealed today, that PKP Cargo has lost nearly 7% of the cargo transport market in Poland, primarily at the expense of Deutsche Bahn cargo. This is something worth billions of zlotys. The Germans are taking it over at the expense of a Polish company from which employees are being laid off, employees who were trained within that company, who worked there for years, substantive professional employees. It will be incredibly difficult to get them back, even if we return to power and want to rebuild that company. And the public is not supposed to hear about these things because you're supposed to be hearing that Ziobro has 26 charges against him. That in Matecki's case, there are 16,000 pages in the files just sent to the court. And the fundamental question, could Minister Ziobro allocate the funds from the Justice Fund? Yes, he could. If you win an election, if you have a majority in the Sejm, can you, through a law or a regulation, amend a given legal act? Can you change a given fund to, for example, add new objectives? Yes, you can. Since Tusk's gang was able to transform the Roman Dmowski Institute into an institute that, in reality, often engages in extreme left-wing ideology, well, you have your answer. But in the case of the Justice Fund, very little actually changed. And it's a huge lie, what's constantly repeated by the politicians of the, unfortunately, current ruling camp, that the Justice Fund is only for post-penitentiary aid and for helping victims of crime. There is also a third main objective, preventing crime, counteracting the causes of crime. And in the legal provisions in force today, which in the last 2 years neither Bodnar nor Żurek have even touched, they haven't even proposed changing this law so that even without the president, it could be passed by parliament, allowing them to say, see, we changed the rules. No, they never introduced anything like that. There are also provisions stating that the Justice Fund can cover expenses for publicizing the Justice Fund's activities and for organizing training sessions. And it was exactly these kinds of competitions that the Minister of Justice announced. He had full discretion over the Justice Fund. He could decide which of the organizations that submitted bids would receive support. So let's say, for example, that Bodnar or Żurek are operating under these same rules today, and they get the idea to fund an organization that, from their point of view, fights, anti-Semitism or so-called homophobia, or what they consider to be so-called hate speech. Because after all, organizations like that today get millions in funding from every direction. And they carry out such a project, and 10 organizations apply for the competition, including, for example, the Foundation Center for Monitoring Anti-Polonism, which has the best written proposal, 100 out of 100. And Adam Bodnar or Waldemar Żurek, according to the rules, can choose not to grant funds to this foundation and instead grant funds to some LGBT organization that had a much worse written proposal. And these are the regulations that are in force. And the Minister of Justice, based on these regulations, based on these same regulations, because this is extremely important, granted funds, for example, to the Badzik Clinic, the foundation, that is the Akogo Foundation. It was tens of millions of zlotys for the creation of a clinic for people in comas so they could be woken up. Something incredibly beneficial. Why? Because such people are often victims of crimes, whether it's, for example, a brutal beating or they fall into a coma after an accident caused by a drunk driver. And the funds went to that. And really, if they wanted to hold everyone accountable today who received funds this way, well, they should raid the Budzik clinic at 6 in the morning and, confiscate the beds, because that's evidence of crimes, beds on which these people are lying, who, well, I hope will wake up. And based on these same regulations, funds to combat Christianophobia were received by the Fidei Defensor Association. The Lux Veritatis Association or Foundation also received funds. And Bodnar said that there's no such thing as Christianophobia in Poland, that there are no hate crimes against Christians. In 2020, we had the culmination, a wave of these troglodytic protests which concerned the Constitutional Tribunal's ruling on abortion, where the judges of the tribunal ruled that you cannot kill sick children in Poland. And Donald Tusk's politicians, that gang, whipped up a spiral of hatred against PiS and against the Catholic Church. And we had, across the entire country, mass devastation of monuments, chapels, crosses, churches, disruptions of holy masses, attacks on priests, physical attacks, beatings of priests, cursing at priests walking down the street. And among other things, the Fidei Defensor Association was involved in precisely this. 1, reporting these crimes, and 2, providing assistance to the victims of these crimes. But they went further. In a godly spirit, for example, they restored a devastated figure in a sanctuary. In Szczecin, here in Szczecin, they restored a historic figure of Christ, which is an element of the local landscape there. Even if many people don't go to church, the churches are historical monuments. These figures are historical monuments, and they were being massively devastated. Across the whole country, they provided help. They also organized training for seniors, which today is considered a crime. Yet just a month ago, Żurek announced the exact same thing, that there would be training for seniors on how not to fall victim to crime. So the exact same thing that Fidei Defensor did is being called a crime. But today, Żurek commissioned someone else to do it, and suddenly it's okay. And public funds can be spent on that. So we have a competition for counteracting Christianophobia, for counteracting a crime, several crimes that concern religiously motivated hatred. And it's also worth emphasizing that one of Donald Trump's first decisions after he won the election in the United States concerned precisely this: to establish an office in the White House for a prosecutor who would prosecute crimes of Christianophobia. And do such crimes also exist in the United States? The murder of Charlie Kirk, where the majority of commentators clearly and explicitly state that he was murdered for his Christian views. Besides, in most of his statements, these views, he wasn't even a Catholic. But he constantly talked about being a Christian, being proud of it, and he built his identity and his worldview on the basis of Christianity. Around the world, Christians are now the most persecuted followers of any given religion. Mass murders right now in Nigeria, throughout Western Europe, churches are being destroyed, devastated, largely by illegal migrants from Muslim countries. And Adam Bodnar came out and stated that this was inconsistent with the goals of the Justice Fund. Total absurdity and a total mockery. And now there are accusations against me. Giertych writes that I was rigging tenders. In the Justice Fund, there were no tenders at all. In the years when these organizations received funds for a public mission, that is, to carry out what the state should be doing, I was a councilman for the city of Szczecin. I saw Minister Ziobro once in a blue moon on rare occasions. I wasn't even a member of parliament. I didn't hold any position like deputy minister or head of a political cabinet. No. And yet I'm facing accusations as if I were a deputy minister and influenced someone in the way you would in a tender. Something like that never happened. All the ideas and their entire implementation were handled by the Ministry of Justice, based on the law and the fact that the minister could shape things as he wished within his competencies. He wanted to fight Christianophobia, so he fought Christianophobia. He wanted to build the Budzik clinic. He built the Budzik clinic. He wanted to support hospitals, for example, by purchasing CT scanners precisely to help victims of crime. So he did that because this is also extremely important. Where does the money in the Justice Fund come from? A PSL member of parliament came out yesterday and said that was our money. But ladies and gentlemen, the money from the Justice Fund is money from criminals. So if a PSL member of parliament says it's their money, well, one might ask or even state, well, maybe in part it is. Or at least it will turn out to be so in 2 years when the government changes. Because we will certainly not let these people off the hook, especially after what they are doing right now. We have money from people who commit traffic offenses for the most part. So helping the victims of these crimes means helping accident victims, as I've already said. And for hospitals, there were purchases of CT scanners. For the volunteer fire departments, there were purchases of equipment that was used to rescue victims of crimes as well, but also for the general activities of the VFDs. Can anyone state on the record that funding the VFD is an act against the state? Every zloty spent on volunteer firefighters, on new equipment, a new uniform, a new vehicle is a zloty invested in the safety of the Polish people. And yet they managed to turn that into a crime. But only when the money came from the Justice Fund or when politicians associated with Zbigniew Ziobro were present at the handover of those funds. Because today, for the past 2 years, when members of the PSL, or less often the Civic Platform, show up in droves at equipment handovers for the VFD, it's no longer a crime. It's considered engagement, a positive pro-social activity. Do you see the hypocrisy, the extreme hypocrisy in these actions? Michał Woś, that's also worth commenting on. He participated in the transfer of public funds, 25 million zlotys from the Justice Fund, to fight crime, the worst kind of crime, pedophiles, agents of foreign intelligence services, VAT mafias, foreign mafias, in other words, for the purchase of Pegasus. And today he's being held accountable for that. Both I and Minister Michał Woś have had our bank accounts frozen for several million zlotys. That doesn't mean we had several million zlotys in our accounts, it means we're in the negative. So I had something like, I don't know, maybe 20 or 30,000 zlotys in my account. After I was released from custody, that was my salary that had come in for 2 or 3 months, my per diems. And all of it was seized after my release from a new account. This was done to oppress us as much as possible, to humiliate us, to make it impossible for us to pay for our defense, for a lawyer. Well, if there are 16,000 pages of the indictment or this so-called evidence, I can't possibly go through it all myself. It would take several lawyers to do that. The cost of the arrest proceedings alone is around 80 to 90,000 zlotys. A member of parliament earns about 10 to 12,000 zlotys. And by blocking all our funds down to zero, because a bailiff is supposed to at least leave you money to live on, here our funds have been blocked completely down to zero as opposition MPs. And as opposition MPs, they entered our homes at 6 in the morning without having our immunity lifted. In the case of my arrest, I was in custody for 2 months. And the decision was made by a judge who wasn't selected by lottery. The very same one who decided on the arrest of Father Michał Olszewski. And she had no opportunity to actually familiarize herself with the case files. With those 16,000 pages, after an hour and a half, or 2 at the most, the decision to arrest was already made. And the lawyer, I had no contact with a lawyer for 2 weeks, with anyone. This is also a complete violation of the right to a defense, meaning I had absolutely no influence on the appeal. My lawyer wrote it, and well, an appeal like that should be considered within a week of the arrest at most to determine if the arrest was actually justified. My hearing to consider the appeal was held after 2 months, which was just a few days before the deadline when I was supposed to be released from custody. Of course, the prosecutor's office filed for a 3-month extension because they wanted to hold me indefinitely, and most certainly for the duration of Karol Nawrocki's campaign. But The judges from Justitia determined that the charges were so absurd that there was no need to apply custody. Besides, after I was released, another appeal was filed against the preventive measures, and the judges immediately lifted all my contact bans, including with Minister Ziobro and Marcin Romanowski. And now, in the context of Minister Ziobro's arrest, just look at how absurd this is. The judges lift my ban on contacting Minister Ziobro, and now he's supposed to be arrested because he might obstruct justice. Well, how is that possible when for 2 years he sat next to me in the same? He was functioning for 2 years, although his ability to function was, of course, marked by illness, by a fight for his life, which I'll get to in a moment. But let me get back to my arrest. When I was arrested, both the prosecutor's office and the public found out that I have cancerous lesions in my stomach. Not at a dangerous stage yet, but it could have progressed quickly, and unfortunately, it could have become a threat to my health and my life. And what those barbarians did, because there's no other way to describe it, was to completely ignore my scheduled surgery to remove those cancerous lesions. They did it deliberately, probably, so I would worry about whether I would survive, whether there wouldn't be some changes, I don't know, maybe that it wouldn't become malignant. They deliberately took away my appointment, deliberately didn't send me for the surgery, perhaps being aware that I might decide to lie in this particular situation to get out and to save my life. After all, Roman Giertych posted directly to that Ania, the one from Mateusz Morawiecki's chancellery. Well, she saw it on TV that if you say something, that was the implication. Against Mateusz Morawiecki, then you'll get to see your son and your son won't commit suicide. These are the kinds of actions they take. This is total communism, ladies and gentlemen. And once they sent me to the hospital, I had an escort of a dozen or so officers armed to the teeth, including so-called special forces from the prison service, all masked, 2-meter-tall thugs. And in those hospital corridors, I moved around like a real mafia boss. I don't know what they were expecting, that maybe, Mariusz Gosek with the people, whom I once again thank very sincerely, who were praying outside the detention center, that they would come and break me out by force. Well, these are madmen who acted deliberately to intimidate, deliberately to burden us with some guilt, a guilt that we do not bear at all. Not me, not Marcin Romanowski, not Zbigniew Ziobro, not Michał Woś. And after I returned from the hospital, from the examination, they decided to move me from the hospital cell to a regular cell, specifically so that every day I would have to listen to the screams of those inmates, all sorts of prisoners, with death threats against me and against Zbigniew Ziobro. And I'm now moving on to Zbigniew Ziobro's arrest itself. Why? In my opinion, to kill him, to put it bluntly. And Żurek himself doesn't have to do it. Donald Tusk doesn't have to do it. There are people in prison there who have very long sentences, among other things for Fiat mafias, for typical mafias, human trafficking, murders, rapes, pedophilia, trafficking in children, in human lives, or, for example, drug mafias. After all, this so-called king of designer drugs threatened Minister Ziobro. He wanted to pay for someone to kill him. And Minister Ziobro is supposed to be in the same detention center with people like that. During the previous governments of Donald Tusk, we had the so-called serial suicide perpetrator. Whether these are conspiracy theories or not, everyone can judge for themselves, but something like that did happen. A lot of people connected, among others, with the Smolensk plane crash died in completely strange, to put it mildly, circumstances. And when we have Donald Tusk again, and the Minister of Justice is, in my opinion, a total political madman, would Minister Ziobro have protection for that most basic value, which is life? In my opinion, no. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is actually the most important thing in this matter. Minister Zbigniew Ziobro has full knowledge, for example, about Giertych, about Nowak, about Grodzki, about Tusk. And that is the biggest threat to them, and they are trying to eliminate him. And finally, a summary. I'm also supposed to answer for allegedly not working at the state forests when I announced my work at the state forests at a press conference. And the information about it was in all the Szczecin media, and not only there, but also in the national media, where I repeatedly said publicly that I work at the state forests and spoke as an employee of the state forests, where I went on business trips. From those trips, in the files, those trips are detailed. There are my reports, emails, everything. They were able to say that I didn't work a single day there. So I might as well be charged with war crimes, because you can just invent charges so that all the media copy them and simply turn a person into a criminal. And that's how the system of intimidation of the Third Polish Republic operated and still operates. But there's the internet, and thanks to it, I can record such videos and give you some kind of response. Because notice that at the immunity committee, I couldn't present my case. They wanted to arrest me. They wanted to deprive me of my freedom, and I couldn't present evidence of my innocence. So I was completely deprived of the opportunity to explain what I did, for example, at the state forests, of presenting legal arguments in the case of the Justice Fund based on specific documents. And if it weren't for social media, if it weren't for Republika, Radio Maria, Dzień Polsce 24, Duże Rzeczy, we would be completely deprived of the opportunity to present to you all these vile attacks from our perspective. It would be Michnik, Walter, or some guy at Polsat or at the forcibly taken over Neo-TVP who would decide who gets to speak. Well, those times are gone, but they want them to return, among other things, by introducing the DSA Act, which is this internet censorship that I hope Karol Nawrocki will stop. So, ladies and gentlemen, we have Woś, me, Romanowski, Ziobro, and on the other side we have Tomasz Grodzki, where 200 people wanted to testify in his case. We have Roman Giertych, who spent a year in Italy and only returned after he had immunity and Donald Tusk was in power. We have Nowak, in whose acquaintances' table leg 4 million zlotys were found, and no one wants to admit to those 4 million zlotys, where fingerprints were found on some rubber bands. Well, this is the Neumann Doctrine in full. Turning people like that into innocent individuals and turning us, people who, like Marcin Romanowski, have to seek asylum somewhere, or me, who was in custody and they deliberately wanted to show me in handcuffs, or Minister Ziobro today, whom they also want to show in handcuffs. And comparing these two worlds, it's simply absurd. We, as the Center for Monitoring Anti-Polonism Foundation, fully supported Fidei Defensor, and we will continue to do so. Fidei Defensor was taken over today by Odo Juris, and I sincerely thank Attorney Kwaśniewski for extending a helping hand to Adam, who manages Fidei Defensor, who was also arrested, who was put in an extreme situation with 2 children, where all his accounts were also blocked, not just the organizations, but his private accounts as well. It's barbarism, one could say. And I'm absolutely right here that they are barbarians. And we have taken people to court like Shirin Vilgus, like Marta Lempart, like Zelt recently, a high-profile case where Żurek withdrew the appeal in the case of Captain Michalska. So they are seething with hatred towards us, including towards my foundation. But it's also worth stressing that my foundation, the Center for Monitoring Anti-Polonism, has never used any public funds, only from payments from private individuals. Just yesterday, I was settling the fundraiser for equipment for the citizen patrols. Almost 200,000 zlotys in payments from individual people, from thousands of people. Drones were purchased, flashlights, binoculars, equipment for flying in the forest, for patrols. I really, once again, want to thank everyone who supported my foundation, and we will continue our work, including holding these people accountable. I just recently gave testimony in the case of the election silence violation by Mircea and by Gazeta Wyborcza. And these are the types of cases we are constantly reporting, or issues related to the promotion of banderism. We will prosecute all of this while they try to turn us into criminals so that people won't trust us, but they will not succeed. We will fight whether in the courts or anywhere else, in the world of politics, in the world of social media, traditional media, to show that today we are dealing with barbarians who are much worse than they were or just the same as the communists. Best regards, Dariusz Matecki.